Second World War by Martin Gilbert. Chapter 6. Dunkirk, May 1940. It was on 26 May 1940 that Hitler realised he had made a grievous error in approving the halt order of May 24. Hitherto he had not appreciated that the British Expeditionary Force was preparing for evacuation. That morning, however, German air reconnaissance planes reported that there were 13 warships and 9 troop transports in Dunkirk harbour. It is probable, German Army intelligence concluded, that the embarkation of the British Expeditionary Force has begun. At 1:30 that afternoon, Hitler sent for his army commander-in-chief and agreed, General Jodl noted, to a forward thrust from the west by armoured groups and infantry divisions in the direction Tournai, Cassel, Dunkirk. The order went out by telephone from Hitler's headquarters at 3:30 that afternoon. 3.5 hours later, at 7 o'clock in the evening, a radio signal sent from the Admiralty in London to Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay at Dover instructed the Admiral, Operation Dynamo is to commence. Dynamo was the code name chosen for the evacuation from Dunkirk of as many soldiers as possible. On May 26, it was expected that 45,000 men could be taken off in the 2 days, which was seen as the maximum that would be available. As Hitler and von Rundstedt had agreed, the German Air Force struck with all its strength to make the evacuation impossible. But the pilots of Fighter Command, Britons, Canadians and Poles among them, were equally determined to keep the skies above the beaches clear enough to evacuate the maximum number of troops. In the 9 days of evacuation, 176 German aircraft were shot down over the beaches, for a loss of 106 British aircraft. The battle in the sky had helped to avert disaster. Also contributing to the success of the evacuation were the British troops fighting rearguard actions around the whole Dunkirk perimeter, as well as those who were besieged in Calais. At the southern edge of the Dunkirk perimeter, 50 miles from the port itself, there was savage fighting on May 27 between units of the SS Death's Head Division and British troops. On May 27, Operation Dynamo was underway, the Dunkirk beaches crowded with troops waiting for boats to take them off. Above Dunkirk that day, 50 German aircraft were destroyed, for the loss of 14 British planes. But the German air attacks were on such a scale that many of the troops cursed the Royal Air Force for not doing more to protect them. Among the hundreds of craft which came from all the ports and seaside resorts of southern Britain that day was Mona's Isle, a former pleasure steamer which was already in commissioned service as an armed boarding vessel. Bombed as she reached the open sea, 40 of those being evacuated on her were killed. That day, in a measure designed to make a German parachute landing in Britain more difficult, orders were given for fields in eastern England to be ploughed and suitable obstacles scattered on other possible landing grounds. At the same time, British bombers, taking a new initiative, flew over the Ruhr to aim their bombs at the German oil-producing plant at Gelsenkirchen. During the previous 24 hours, 14,000 men had been brought back safely from Dunkirk to Dover. Even as their evacuation proceeded, Allied troops in northern Norway were still advancing. During the early hours of May 28, the long-awaited but now virtually ignored entry into Narvik took place. During the final battle for the port, 150 British, French, Norwegian and Polish soldiers were killed. Unknown to those who entered Narvik, the British War Cabinet had already authorised Operation Alphabet, the evacuation of Narvik, once it had been captured. During May 28, a further 25,000 British troops were brought safely back from Dunkirk. Among the rescue vessels was a holiday resort paddle steamer, the Brighton Belle. In collision with a wreck, she was one of 4 ships to be sunk that day. Still holding the dwindling perimeter, British troops even managed for a while to cut off the SS commander Sepp Dietrich from his men. He was forced to spend much of May 28 hiding in a ditch. At Dunkirk, the evacuation continued throughout May 29. In the early hours, the destroyer Grafton was attacked by 2 German motor torpedo boats while picking up survivors from another ship. 35 of her officers were killed. Later that day, when HMS Waverley, a paddle steamer previously converted into a minesweeper with 600 soldiers on board, was attacked on its return journey by 12 German dive bombers, it too proved an unequal battle. The single anti-aircraft gun on board was augmented by the massed rifle fire of the soldiers, but after half an hour of persistent air attack, Waverley disappeared beneath the waves. More than 300 of the troops on board were drowned. In these dark days, Churchill wrote to all government ministers and senior civil servants that day. The Prime Minister would be grateful if all his colleagues in the government, as well as high officials, would maintain a high morale in their circles. Not minimising the gravity of events, but showing confidence in our ability and inflexible resolve to continue the war till we have broken the will of the enemy to bring all Europe under his domination. During May 29, a total of 47,310 men were evacuated from Dunkirk. For the British Army, the Dunkirk saga was almost at an end. After 4 days of evacuation, the Germans were drawing closer, and the German airstrikes becoming more intense. Up to the early hours of May 30, as many as 80,000 men had been evacuated. But conditions on the beaches, Churchill told the War Cabinet that morning, were difficult. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Churchill instructed Lord Gort that once his fighting force in the Dunkirk perimeter was reduced to the equivalent of 3 divisions, he should hand over his command and return to England. Gort's successor would be ordered to carry on the defence of the perimeter, but, Churchill added, when in his judgment no further organised resistance is possible, and no further proportionate damage can be inflicted upon the enemy, he is authorised, in consultation with the senior French commander, to capitulate formally to avoid useless slaughter. Among the defenders of the Dunkirk perimeter who were killed on May 30 was Ronald Cartland, a Member of Parliament. The way of life for which he fought, Winston Churchill wrote 6 months later, will certainly prevail and persist because of the striving and sacrifices of men such as he. At Dunkirk, French ships had joined with British in the work of rescue. On May 30, the French destroyer Bourrasque, striking a mine while on her way back to Dover, sank. Approximately 150 of the men whom she had just rescued from the beaches were drowned. A little later, the British destroyer Wakefield was attacked by German dive bombers and sank. That morning, however, despite the air bombardment, 4,000 men were evacuated in a single hour. On Churchill's specific instructions, French and British troops were being evacuated side by side. On May 31st, the total figure of British and French troops evacuated during that one day was 68,104. Despite the Belgian surrender, many Belgian fishing vessels had also joined the armada of little ships. On 31st of May, the Lady Susanna brought 105 men back to Dover, the Zwaluw 58, the Korjezu 274, the Jonge Jan 270, and the A5 234. That night, General Gort left Dunkirk and returned to England, leaving General Alexander to supervise the final phase of the evacuation. Only 20,000 British and 60,000 French troops were still waiting to be embarked. During 1st of June, however, several German units had pressed near enough to Dunkirk to be able to bombard the beaches with their artillery. In the air, the German dive bombers intensified their attack. In a few hours, 3 British and 1 French destroyer were sunk, together with 2 troop transports, a minesweeper and a gunboat. That day, however, despite the air and land bombardments, 64,229 men were taken off. At midnight on 2nd of June, the last 3,000 British and French troops had been evacuated from Dunkirk, bringing the total to 338,226 men in 7 days. In all, 222 naval vessels and 665 civilian craft had ferried between Dunkirk and the British coast. 6 destroyers and 24 smaller naval vessels. 6 destroyers and 24 smaller naval vessels had been lost. 38 British destroyers, never built to carry a mass of men, had brought away 91,624. Minesweepers had brought back 30,942. 30 Dutch motor vessels had carried 20,284. French destroyers had lifted 7,623. Hundreds of merchant vessels, troop transports and sloops had brought back tens of thousands more. But in many ways, the most remarkable feat of all was performed by the little ships, trawlers, coasters, tugboats, open boats, ships' lifeboats, fishing vessels, river cruisers, paddle steamers, and more than 600 small pleasure craft, which between them brought off more than 80,000 men, in groups from several hundred to half a dozen. The success of these ships was no less effective an act of war than a naval victory. Also above the skies of Dunkirk, the Royal Air Force won what was certainly the first substantial victory of the Allied air. On several of the 11 days between May 25 and June 5th, as many as 3 German planes had been destroyed for every British plane shot down. An augury of air battles yet to come. There was, however, a depressing side to these successes. 34,000 British soldiers had been taken prisoner of war in and around Dunkirk. The last 3,000 troops to have been evacuated, as well as 71 heavy guns and 595 vehicles, General Alexander, together with the senior naval officer at Dunkirk, Captain Tennant, toured the harbour and shoreline in a fast motorboat to make sure that not a single soldier remained to be taken off. Satisfied that this was indeed so, they then returned to the quayside and embarked for Britain.